All right, everybody. Hey, thanks so much for coming out and having me here. My name's Jesse Sanders. I'm an Angular GDE from Denver, Colorado. Today we're going to talk about NgRx. And actually, like, who's using NgRx right now? Okay, so a few hands, so maybe 10, 15%. So this is something that comes up a lot, is people are like, well, I'm not really sure that I'm ready for NgRx. Seems like a lot of work, and I'm not really sure, like, where, is my application really, does it really need NgRx? So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Is this going to work? No? All right. See if I can get my clicker here to work, otherwise we'll... Yeah, okay. It was just stuck, so the PowerPoint presentation was stuck there. So again, my name's Jesse Sanders. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Brebug. We do Angular consulting in Denver, Colorado, and work with a variety of clients. That's my real contact information, so if you want to reach me, I'll also have that at the end of the slides. We can talk about, where is that pulling up? There we go. I don't know why that bar's still there. There we go. All right, so today when we talk about building an application, there's so many different options, right? So what that looks like, there's NgRx, that's the buzzword right now. A lot of people are talking about NgRx and how you should be implementing this into your application. But there's also things like NgRx Actions, NgXS, NgRx Data, MobX, and then whatever just came out last week, right? So there's lots of different options. Are you guys familiar with like MobX or NgXS? So just different state management tools that you can implement in your applications. So with NgRx, there's so much to learn. So we got to talk about actions, reducers, effects, then we have selectors, and then there's just the overall architecture. How do I bring this all together? So do I really, really, really need NgRx? If you're asking yourself that, I'm telling you, you probably don't. Now, by the way, I love NgRx. This is what we build. Most of the applications that we build are large enterprise applications, and so we use NgRx probably 99% of the time. But for most people, when they're starting out and building their application, they're asking the question, is my application complex enough? And if you're asking that question, you already know the answer. It's not. Okay? And so what happens is that people get kind of talked into, well, we should do NgRx. And so they spend all this time trying to build out actions, reducers, effects, and whatnot, and they miss their project deadlines. Sound familiar, right? Going down this path that we really didn't need to go down, and before we know it, we're missing our deadlines and things aren't going great. So I want to start simple. I also want an upgrade path. So if I who selected an architecture in the past that then as you get towards like the last like 10 or 20% of your application, you realize you've coded yourself into a corner, and now you're kind of stuck with the choices that you made, and your application is gaining complexity, and you don't know how to get out of it, right? We've all been there, right, at some point. So let's talk about architecture goals. So when we are building a new application, that's kind of weird. All right, so don't look over here. All of you, look over here. All right, so let's see here. We want to maximize code reuse. So let's talk about the typical application. Who has in their Angular application, they have a service called session service? Anybody? So it usually starts out, what we do is we put our JWT token in there, right? It's cool, it's very innocent. Maybe 10, 20 lines of code, right? We're good. Then we load some roles and permissions, and we put those in there. And then, well, we need this list of users later, so we'll put that in there. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, well, we got to be able to alert these other components what's going on. So now we've got this really crazy emitting and broadcasting sort of thing going on, and trying to figure out like who's getting updated, and hey, new data here. And before you know it, at the top of it, it's 600 lines now, from 30 lines to 600 lines. And at the top, it has this really nice header that says, "Do not touch. Will break production. Please contact Jesse Sanders before making any changes," right? I've been there. It's not a great place to be. So one of the things when we're talking about building new applications is we want to be able to share data between components. And we want to be able to stream that data between components. So anytime, instead of having this really crazy, messy eventing thing and hey, who's updating what, that I could actually share the data, it's streamed data that automatically get updated, and I wouldn't have to do anything. Would that sound like a good idea? Would you guys be down for that? Right? All right. And the other thing here is reducing complexity. So when we look at frameworks like NgRx, the whole goal is to reduce complexity. But maybe my application's not complex enough to do NgRx, but I still want to reduce complexity. So we're going to talk about that today as well. And it needs to be scalable. This needs to be a solid architecture that I can build applications on, and I'm not coding myself into a corner where all of a sudden when I get towards the end, I'm realizing like things are going very, very poorly. So we're going to talk about a couple of core concepts today. And this concept here is, the first one is container presenter. Does anybody know what container presenter is? Anybody using it? Wow, this is awesome. Hardly anybody, I think one person raised their hand. If you get nothing else out of this, and even if you don't implement service with a subject, please, please, please learn container presenter. It will change how you write code. You'll write much better code, cleaner code, much simpler. It's going to be easier to test, and I'm going to show you how to do it today. The other core concept that we're going to talk about is this mystery called service with a subject. Had anybody heard of service with a subject? Okay. Who's been able to find an article on service with a subject? Same problem I had. There's very few articles on it. And it usually is just kind of this de facto statement of like, hey, you probably don't need NgRx, just go use service with a subject. You go to look it up and you're like, and there's nothing out here. There's like one Stack Overflow article that's like very confusing and very difficult to kind of work through. So we're going to look at service with a subject, and we're going to demystify this and make it very, very simple, because the concept is so simple that you're just missing it, okay? So we're going to look at that. So let's talk back to the container presenter. You might have heard this called smart components, dumb components. Okay, let's move towards container presenter, and so we're going to talk about containers first. So containers are really just, they're top level features. They're pages within your application. You can have, containers will contain child components within them, and we can also talk about that containers can actually have containers within them, but that's fairly rare, and I don't want to confuse you with that really today. But if you start to see logic that is occurring from multiple containers, then it's probably time to break that logic out into its own container, and then they can be contained within another container. So kind of a sub-container thing. But for the most part, don't worry about that. It's really not that critical. You'll start to recognize the pattern, and you should be able to see that, hey, this really needs to, I need to stop duplicating, come from drive principles, and make sure that I can put this into its own container. So what do containers do? They control page flow. They're the ones that decide what happens. So this includes loading and saving of data. So they understand how to get data, how to save it, how to do things. The other thing that they do is they handle child events. Okay, we're gonna see in a minute here why this is really important, but they're gonna decide. So when the child says, hey, somebody clicked on something, the container is gonna decide what that means, not the child component. There we go. So containers. So here's an example of a container. What we have here is a user's component, and it has a user's $sign. I like to go ahead and use a suffix of $sign so I know I'm dealing with an observable. So I go ahead and declare user's $sign as an observable of type user array, and then I am calling on the ng init, I'm calling the user service load all, and I'm setting the return of that to my local variable, and then I have a event handler here so that when the child component bubbles up and someone has clicked on the user, that I'm going to just do a console log here. But typically I'm going to be doing some sort of action with that user, right? So this should look fairly familiar to you, right? This should look like how you're kind of writing code right now. We're loading data from a service, we're handling child events. There's really not a whole lot of magic that's going on here. So this is just a general container and not a container calling a service with a subject. Great, so, oh, we went too far. There we go. So presentation component. So the presentation component is the dumb component. It doesn't really know what happens. It presents data. It makes things pretty. It knows nothing about services or stores. So if your presentation component is injecting a service into it, or it's injecting an NgRx store into it, it is no longer a presentation component. It's really a container at that point. So you want to rethink that. You want presentation components to receive everything that they get via inputs. So they receive their data via inputs. They don't know about even observables. Okay, so this morning we started out with a talk talking about change detection, okay? By it not knowing what an observable is, what's going to happen is it's going to get that new stream of data, it's going to unwrap via an async pipe, and it's going to automatically get the new data, and so we can take advantage of that optimized change detection, and we don't have to have Angular sitting there watching like, hey, did you do anything? Did you do anything? And this is like over and over per second, like a million times, right? So they receive the data via inputs, and then they turn around and they display the data. They make it pretty. They raise events to the parents. So this doesn't matter whether it's a system event or some sort of user event. I've clicked on, I've hovered on, I've typed something, whatever that is, that event, I'm going to raise that back up to the parent and say, hey, somebody clicked on the user. Here's the user. What would you like to do with it? I don't know. You could throw it away. I don't, you know. And that's how you want your components to be. Defer, defer, defer. The presentation components make no decisions. They're going to go ahead and allow that decision to bubble up to the parent and allow the parent to do this. So here is our users list presentation component. You can see it has an input. It's of type users, or it's called users, and it's of type user array. So there's no observable, doesn't understand observables. There's no constructor. We're not injecting any services, doesn't know where the data comes from. It just sort of kind of like comes trickling in, and they receive the data, and then they take the data, and now we're going to render it and make it look really pretty. In a case here, we've got an output, so called user click, which is an event emitter, and on the user click, we want to go ahead and emit, here's the user. So you can see there's no decision tree here, right? I'm not actually saying, hey, if this user, if session service dot role equals admin, and they click the user, what happens there is when we start to interject that kind of logic into our components is they start to become very fragile. And what happens is like you'll come in and you'll go like, oh, hey, look, yeah, it's admin, we'll do this. And you come along and you go, well, if we have a standard user, we want to do this. And then you come in and you write one for this other type of user, and then I get the component, I'm like, this is a mess. Okay, copy the component, delete all of your code, and now I'm going to start over with my version of the component. Does this sound familiar? Right? This happens a lot. Whether you want to admit it or not, this is what we see out there in the consulting world, is that we're copying code instead of reusing components. Okay? So here's our very complicated HTML. As you can see, it's really, really simple. All we're doing is we're using our ng4 directive to iterate over the list of users, and then we're rendering out the name and the role. In this case here, if we want to track that click event, I just say, hey, if they click on the span, then go ahead and call the user click with that user, and then that's going to call the previous method over here on the on-user click and emit that up to the parent, and then let the parent decide. All right, so if you're a visual learner, here's the visual side of it. We've got our container presenter. We've got our input being passed from the container down to the presenter, and then the output for any sort of events going back up to the container. Okay, this is, in a nutshell, this is container presenter. And if you start implementing this in your applications, what you'll find is that your tests are really, really easy. Okay, you don't have all this crazy logic that you have to track in every single, in every single presentation component. Now they're super simple, they're dumb, they don't understand it. All they're going to do is really display data. If you're not using Jest.js, who's using Jest.js? Does anybody know about it? So there's this compare to match snapshot. And so I can actually feed it, I can take my component, give it a certain set of data, and it will render the same exact way from the HTML every single time. So I don't have to have these very complex mocks or trying to track what the data looks like. I can actually just take the HTML output and put that into a snapshot, store that for later, and when I run the test with the same exact data, it should produce the same result. So So what if my component is really, really simple? So this is a common argument that I hear from people like, well, I don't even really want to do container presenter because my components are so simple that I don't really need it. And you might be right. But the problem is that all components start out really, really, really simple. And then management comes along and says, hey, could you take this nice little feature here and bolt this on, and then bolt this on, and then bolt this on? And before you know it, you've got kind of a mess going on. So do it anyway. This is considered a best practice. If you're not implementing this in your code, like start today, start playing around with Container Presenter and start to see how much value you're going to get out of this. It's going to make things a lot easier. So you're going to get reusable components. So now what we talked about earlier where we had all this logic about, hey, if it's an admin user, if it's a standard user, if it's this kind of user, you don't have to worry about that. That logic is actually now going to get contained at the page level in the container, and I don't have to worry about it in these small child components, in these presentations. Also, I get a clear upgrade path. So as I said here, as things get more complex and we're getting bolt-on, 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 and there's more and more things going on, now I have a clear path to go to NgRx. So one of the things that we're going to look at the very end here is how do I then go from service with a subject and take it to NgRx if I want to. So the other big advantage here is async pipe. So you can do async pipe obviously without doing Container Presenter, but it's just a lot easier in my mind to do a Container Presenter. So what I mean by that is the container can go ahead and call the load, get the data, and then using the async pipe, it can pass it down to the child component. It's nice, it's clean. I get the change detection. So that's the better performance is because now on that child component, I can go ahead and say change detection strategy to be on push. So since it's going to be immutable, and anytime I get a new value onto the stream, it's going to unwrap that, it's going to send it down to the child component. The child component's going to get a new object reference, and boom, it doesn't have to do any of the crazy change detection. So we're going to get a lot better performance out of our applications. So the other thing is, I like to say is KISS. Keep it simple, silly. So let's see here. So core concepts. The one thing we haven't talked about so far is the one thing that this talk is all about, which is service with a subject. So there's a lot of mystery around this. A lot of people don't really understand it, and I was one of them. Till maybe about 6 months ago, where I started to do some research. I was like, you know, maybe we don't need to do NgRx on everything. So we talked about this earlier with containers and regular services. So in this example, I've got a container called the users component, and then I have my user service. And so if you look at the user service, it looks like pretty much any other service where we say, okay, I'm going to return the result of the HTTP GET call. That's going to be an observable, right? And we're going to send that back. And then on our component, we're going to call the user service load all, and we're going to assign that to our observable, right? Very, very standard stuff. So what is service with a subject? Interesting enough, it's just a regular old service. There's really not a whole lot of magic here. You don't have to get some new schematic to be able to create service with a subject. It uses a local behavior subject. Okay. One of the questions I get often, and we were talking about it actually at dinner last night, is that, well, why don't I just use a regular subject? Why do I need to use a behavior subject? Well, the problem is that it depends on when you subscribe, when you're actually getting a reference to that. If you use a subject and you come to the party late, guess what? The bus has already left. There's no value for you, and you're going to get a blank output, right? With a behavior subject, it's going to give you whatever the current value is, okay, regardless of when you come to the party. The other big change here is that service calls now return nothing. So when we make a call to a service to go ahead and get, load all, we're not going to get a reference to anything, okay? We're going to be pointing at the behavior subject, and then we're going to call our service, and then when the service resolves and is complete, our behavior subject then is going to update our local observable. So instead of returning the value, like I said, it's going to set the local variable with that value, and that's how we're going to pick it up. So here's our first example here. This is a service with a subject service. So here we've got our widget service. You can see at the top there, I have a widget $sign assigned to be a new behavior subject. It's of type widget array, and we're going to initialize it with an empty array. And then our load all method is calling the HTTP client, which you've injected on the constructor, and we're going to go ahead and subscribe to that. And when it resolves, we're going to have the widget behavior subject get updated with this new value by calling next. Okay? So notice I'm not returning anything. And when I do call that method, my behavior subject is now going to have that. So let's go back to our session service that we talked about earlier. And when we were storing stuff like, let's say, users or roles or whatnot, we would actually just store it as array data. And the problem with that is that when the array data would change, we'd either have to have crazy change detection stuff going on or having to create all this eventing and all this complexity so we could tell all the components that we're using the users that, hey, something has happened, right? And I need you to now get these users. Now what happens is that because it's a behavior subject, once that gets added, that new value gets set onto the stream, every component that is pointing at that behavior subject instantly has that data. We don't have to wire up anything. So here we've got the service with a subject container. Looks almost identical to what we were looking at before, but now instead of setting this.users equals to the load all, we're going to set this.users $ equal to the user's behavior subject on the user service. And then we're going to go ahead and call the user service load all, and when that resolves, our behavior subject is going to now update our observable. Great. So let's take a look at some code here. We're going to walk through a little bit of code, and I think we're doing lunch immediately after this, so we'll try not to go too long here. But I want to show you a little bit of code and hopefully bring this all together for you. So we're going to take a look at the user model. We're going to look at the user service. We're going to look at the dashboard container. Actually, let me show you something really quick. I've got this really nice UI that I developed. So this is my pride and joy. I'm an artist. So this example is really, really simple, I know, but this actually just is a really good example on how service with a subject works. So I have two different child presentation components here, one called users, one called permissions. And then I've got my driver up here, which is part of my navigation, where I want to be able to switch roles. So I've got admin users and I got standard users. So when we switch to admin, we're going to get a list of all the users, including the admins. And when we switch to standard, we just want to see standard users. Okay? So pretty simple UI. We really have four components here. We have the overall dashboard component. We have the top level nav, and then we have a users list and a permissions component. Okay? So one container, three presentations. So let's come over here and take a look at the code really quick. So on the model, super simple. We just have a interface defined as user on our service. We've got our user service. Should look really familiar to what we looked at in our example before. We have our behavior subject. We have a HTTP client be injected. And here we, after the call is made, we're subscribing. Now, you see I put a little note in here that the filter should really be done server side, but this is just a demo. This is just using in-memory database to be able to pull the data back, but I do want to be able to do the filtering based on the role that's passed in. So this would be something, this aspect here for filters would be removed and we just actually return the data. But for this example here, we're doing the filter and then we're taking that filtered data and injecting it into the stream by calling next. Okay? So that's how we're getting the updated data. If we come over here to our dashboard component, the first thing I want to do before we look at the actual code is the HTML. So if you look at the HTML here, it's really nothing more than a bunch of material design. And then I've got three components, the top nav, then I've got the app users list, and I've got the app permissions. Okay? You can see that on the last two on the users list and the permissions, I'm using the async pipe to go ahead and pass that user's data in. So very, very simple HTML code. And then on the dashboard component itself, we've got our users observable. On our init, we're setting it to the behavior subject on the user service. Then we're calling our load by role and then passing it the name of the role. And then we also have an event handler here, so when the role does change, then we go ahead and call the same method again, load by role, giving it the new role. So where does that come from? So back over here, we have the role change. So when that occurs on the top nav, we want to go ahead and call our local method here on role change with that event. Okay? So there's no wiring. You get that there's no like, hey, watch for this change and then go do this when this happens, okay? None of that is occurring. When that second load happens over here on our on role change, it's going to go ahead and update our behavior subject. We're going to take that new filter users and it's going to be injected into that stream, and then all the child components are automatically going to get that. So let's look at the components. They're pretty simple. So we'll start with the top nav. Here it's really nothing more than a select. We hard-coded our options. Obviously, you wouldn't really want to probably do that. You'd want to inject those as well through an input and pass those down. But really all what's happening here is that on change, we're going to call on role change. You can see the role change is an output event emitter, and when that on role change is called, we're not making any decisions here, right? This component is now going to go ahead and emit that up and allow the parent to decide what we're going to do. So I could actually take this component now and be able to reuse it in 2 or 3 other different pages and be able to change what is the behavior. So maybe I want to have it where I'm changing the role on somebody versus, hey, I'm filtering a list based off of it. So now we don't have to copy and paste this component and remove your code that doesn't align with what I want it to do. Okay. On the user list, same sort of thing. All we're doing is enumerating over this and displaying the ID and the name. And it doesn't know anything about where the data is coming from. It's only receiving it on an input. Again, there's no observables. We're just getting plain user array data down. And notice here, I've got my change detection strategy set to on push. So I have a high performant component that's reusable and can be used in a lot of different situations. Over on the permissions, it's the same exact thing. We are displaying the name and the role. I had a little note there about implementing the on-click. I'd want to put a span, do an on-click deal so I could go ahead and wire up this event emitter. Right now that is currently not working. But it'd be that easy to be able to now emit the event back up to the parent that someone has clicked on this user. Now what do I want to do? Am I adding it to some other list? Am I going to the edit page? My container gets to decide that. All right, so great. So the code I hope you see here, one, it's very, very simple. When you think about writing tests for this code, there's really not a lot of logic that you're going to have to be testing and doing here, okay? So your tests are going to be very lightweight. They're going to be very simple. You're going to be able to work through this very quickly. Really where you're going to spend most of your time on your tests is on your containers, testing out that logic, because that's where really all your decision branching is going to be occurring at. All right, so as promised, how do I upgrade? So great, I've went with your suggestion, okay? You're building this application, everything's going great, and all of a sudden you start running into a page that's getting complex. And you've decided that, okay, I need to manage this complexity. It's time to bring in NgRx. The great thing about NgRx is this: it is not like most other technologies that we'll bring in where it's all or nothing. Either you're 100% in or you're 100% out. It's not that way with NgRx. You can actually bring NgRx in on just your one page that you have the most complexity that you need to simplify, okay? So how do I do the upgrade? Well, I want to introduce you to a very good friend of mine. His name's Thomas Burleson. That's his Twitter handle there. And about 6 months ago, he wrote a really great article on NgRx and facades. Did anybody read this article on Medium? 1, maybe 2, okay. So great article. Talks about how you can simplify NgRx implementations using the facade pattern. So I'm going to shamelessly use some of his images from his blog article because I think he does a really great job of explaining this. If you haven't read this, which is most of you, go out and read this article. It's a really great way of understanding how you can implement NgRx in a simple fashion using the facade pattern. So without NgRx, your component has to interact with the store, the state, the selectors, the actions. In effect, it kind of interacts with the reducers. You know, when we dispatch stuff, it's going to go through the effect, which is going to make the HTTP calls. It's a lot of complexity, and this is, again, why for most applications it's really not necessary to bring NgRx in. Now, what Tom has proposed is that using NgRx Facade, which is really our service with a subject, okay, and we'll take a look at the code difference here and what I would actually have to refactor. Using the Facade, we can allow it to be the one that's interacting with the store and the state and the selectors, the actions, and so on and so forth, and that our components don't actually have to know anything about how the data is actually occurring, okay? So let's take a look at that. Here's our same user service that we were using before, where users was set to a behavior subject. We're now setting it equal to the store select. So this is the actual selector, and we're going to point it towards that. It's doing the same exact thing as the behavior subject for us in terms of how the component views it. In our case here, we're no longer injecting the HTTP client, we're now injecting the store. And when we call load all users, we're no longer using the HTTP client. We're just dispatching the action, load users, and that's going to go ahead and then trigger the effect. The effect is going to go ahead and fire. It's going to go ahead and update the store through the reducer, and in which then in turn the selector is going to go ahead and update its value on that stream, and ta-da, it works exactly the same. If you don't like facades and you don't want to go down this pattern, that's totally fine too. You could refactor your component to use the store. Container presenter is the same exact design pattern that we teach people that are going to use NgRx. Okay, so if you're going to go down in the NgRx path, container presenter is the #1 pattern that you're going to use, so how you organize your components. So it's natural then, it's very simple to go ahead and make this transition from service with a subject. All right, so in summary, I hope you see that what really service with a subject is, which is a very simple pattern. Okay, it's going to solve a lot of the problems that you're probably running into with trying to figure out how do we get components to communicate with each other and tell each other that, hey, data's updated, okay? Super easy to test. Our components are so lightweight, there's not a whole bunch of logic embedded in them, and so it makes our testing a lot easier. We can move through this a lot quicker. We get component reuse. We don't have these big, decision tree blocks that we're going to have to navigate through, which then, by the way, those are the ones that cause the most bugs, right? Because that session service stuff and all the craziness that's going on there, that's all eliminated for you. As I pointed out, the upgrade path to NgRx is really, really easy. So with that, a little bit about myself. As I said earlier, I'm an Angular Google developer expert. I specialize in Angular training and Angular consulting. Thank you so much for having me here. This is my first time in India. Thank you. Thank you. If you have questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter. That is also my real email address, so please don't spam me. But if you have questions, I'm happy to field questions for you, point you towards articles, and try to get you some example code on how you might be able to implement this in your project. So again, thank you everybody for having me. Let's have some lunch.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. Guys, once again, let's give him a big hand.
Also, for those that come out and ask the best questions out in the hallway, I have some swag. I brought a whole bunch of stuff from Denver, a bunch of stickers, a bunch of t-shirts. So if you'd like to come out and ask a question, I'll probably just step out in the hallway here. Would love to give you some like the Angular shirts that we have and what. Not this one though. I have some in the bag. All right, thank you.
Amazing. Another big hand. Fantastic.